Okay, this is your short video on analysis of Richard Wright's Uncle Tom's Children as an example of early 20th century African American literature. If you remember from your introduction video, Richard Wright published this novel, or collection of stories more accurately, in 1938. He is publishing after or towards the latter part of the Harlem Renaissance period, a period in African American literature where many new ideas and new forms and new social activism is being injected into African American art, and largely driven by the idea of what at the start in the early 20s was called the New Negro movement, the New Negro being coined as the term for an African American person who was more socially aware and socially evolved and wanted to pursue different means of achieving equal rights and moving past existent laws on the books and laws in social mores, etc. And this spilled over into the art of the time, which was largely known as the New Negro movement and later the Harlem Renaissance. Wright published these stories together, but he had written them separately and felt that they were very much tied in terms of their thematics, and as I discussed in the previous video, in terms of their recognition of a change and a resistant attitude on the forefront for African Americans. I want to back up some of the things that I sort of glossed over in the introduction to Richard Wright. If we understand the culture, we understand the environment that Wright grew up in the South, we need to understand what is actually going on. And I did mention segregation and Jim Crow specifically, but I wanted to get into them a little bit more. And one of the things that helped actually set in forth the legal aspects of segregation was the 1896 case before the Supreme Court of Plessy versus Ferguson, which established the well-known code, if you will, separate but equal. And this was put into place at the end of the 19th century to help enforce and reinforce the idea that blacks and whites did not have to exist on the same plane, and in fact could have coexistence right next to each other and never have to integrate, except, I mean, that's the idea behind it. And the Plessy versus Ferguson case established this as legal and as a process that could be manifested in anything from swimming pools to restaurants and to outdoor water fountains, you name it. This would be the law of the land. And of course this was the benchmark for segregation throughout the United States until the Brown versus Board of Education case some 60 years later in 1954, which established the finding that separate facilities, separate environments, etc., was inherently unequal. And of course, during that 60 years, there was activism and violence and protest and all sorts of activities going back and forth addressing that very issue. And of course, we know in our sort of rational thinking that 1954 did not end the racial discrepancies and discrimination and activities that were designed to be judging and stereotypical of racial identities, but in terms of the legal aspects of it, it did address those. Now, during this time, one of the most common ways to ensure that this idea of segregation, whether legal or just in social terms, was enforced was something known as lynching. Now, you've all probably heard of lynching as an activity, as an act of violence, a mob taking justice, quote unquote, into their own hands sometimes. And this is predominantly during the late 19th century and into the early parts of the 20th century, even into mid-20th century, a whites towards blacks activity. And oftentimes very gruesome, certainly very public, and occasionally, and more often than not, a sort of communal event, one in which wives, children, and all members of the family would be expected to attend and to find as a spectacle. And without going into too many gruesome details, the majority of the lynchings were directed towards black men, and they were publicly tortured, hanged, burned, put on display, left to be a spectacle, perhaps as the perpetrators thought, as a warning to further the attitude, etc. But otherwise, these lynching victims were largely targeted simply because of their race. Many times the crimes for which they were supposedly being lynched were exaggerated, trumped up altogether, certainly deserving of a fair trial rather than lynch mob justice, but this was not the way that they understood this. In the latter part of the 19th century, there were more than 5,000 African Americans in the United States lynched. Okay, and this was largely after the Civil War. When the Civil War ends and the Reconstruction era begins, and the amendment to the Constitution ends slavery, Southern whites lost confidence, I guess it's confidence, in the justice system, and this led to formation of what is known as the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. This eventually became a tool for maintaining white supremacy. They used this to sort of keep order in the way that they saw it. And these were largely, though not always, largely the perpetrators of the lynch mob justice. Victims, as I said, were usually black men. Crimes ranged from stealing to what was seen as the most egregious, any crime that had to do with a white woman, whether the crime was innuendo or actuality or anything else. These could be interpreted as a crime in any of those senses. Most times, lynching was allowed, if not sort of aided by the law enforcement in the area. So going to the authorities with any sort of help me, was most likely going to be ignored. One of the things that I've put onto your Richard Wright folder is several links to the 1937-39 song Strange Fruit. You'll find a link to the lyrics, a link to the performance, and then also a link to the Wikipedia page. This is a song written in 1937 and probably most famously performed in 1939 by Billie Holiday, a song referring to the strange fruit hanging from trees in the South, indicating the bodies of black victims after a lynching, tortured, and Holiday's rendering of this song is very haunting and very rightfully sad and horrific in its sort of questioning. This is what we're doing to black men and black women in the United States at this time. This was about the same time, in fact, that Richard Wright published Uncle Tom's Children. So it was very timely and would have been on the minds of many, many black artists during this time. After World War I, so backing up a few decades, after World War I, many African Americans who had gone to war intending to serve their country and to perhaps ensure better securities back here in the United States. They felt, sometimes you'll hear what's referred to as a double victory, or the double V, a victory fighting for the United States Army would mean a victory for them racially back home. They would achieve some justice and some success in terms of their rights and recognition. Didn't really happen. They felt like it would happen, but in fact, coming home after World War I, this idea was really sort of hammered back into place by the 1919 summer, which was to its day the most violent racial summer of its time, with lynchings and racial protests and violence against blacks during this time being at an apex. 1919, there were about 20 to 30 different riots in major cities across the United States, where blacks were beginning to see the demand for these rights that they thought that maybe their involvement with the war would bring, and whites and others smashing them down in ways that often resulted either in just general communal violence or targeted lynchings as well. There was a poem, and I've put a link to this poem on your Richard Wright folder as well, by Claude McKay, published during this time, 1919, that indicates, I'm going to go to that now, it's a short poem, indicates the spirit of this newly sort of arised resistant act. And you can see where I'm going with this and relating this to Richard Wright. But I want to look at this Claude McKay poem. If you open the link, it's a very short poem. This was published in that, I'm not sure if it was the summer, but it was in that year, 1919, of this sort of heightened resistant action among African Americans. I'm going to read this poem, and you can look at it, refer back to it on your own. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain, that even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe, though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What, though before us lies the open grave? Like men we'll face the murderous cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. And there's a spirit to this poem that suggests, determination, desperation, and sacrificial sort of for the greater good. If we must die, if we're going to be persecuted, let us not die like dogs, like hogs. Let us die fighting back in a way that sort of conveys this new Negro attitude of the time that we need to demand and no longer be complacent. And if we're going to, quote unquote, die anyway, we must be resistant to this. We must act in response to this. And this was right at the onset, in fact, of that new Negro movement that becomes the Harlem Renaissance. And you can also, to see the transition here, you can see the way that this fits into the spirit of Richard Wright's opening epitaph in his collection, Uncle Tom is Dead. And we talked about this in the last video, the Uncle Tom complacent character as being replaced by the next generation who no longer wants to sit and wait and wants to, in fact, maybe turn the tables and begin to demand justice. This is sort of the lead-in to Richard Wright's story collection here. Now, he opens, and I mentioned this in the last video as well, he opens with this short piece called The Ethics of Living Jim Crow, and these are some scenes that he would put into his autobiography later, Black Boy. He uses these scenes to help frame his as I said last time, his education, the knowledge of how he as a young black man is supposed to correspond with the existent world. And this sort of sets to mind that educational theme. These stories all have moments of education where characters learn or relearn, perhaps, the way that the world sees them. And this ethics of living Jim Crow are all about the scene, the 3 or 4 different scenes he shows you in this, all about him learning his place, learning how lucky he is. Many characters in this section tell him, you're lucky that this didn't happen, his mother included, in ways that say this is the way it is and we can't change that. His family tells him to know his place. The whites that he works for tell him to know his place. His small moment in the elevator where the man takes his hat off and he goes through this sort of inner monologue of how he's supposed to react suggests that he's internalized, the ideas of this particular time, living Jim Crow. And then there's another small theme running throughout that as well of this sort of intangible acting white trope, right? If he was to act white, this would be certainly deserving of violent reaction, whether it be, a full-on lynch mob, or whether it be some sort of anger-induced physical or just really strong verbal lashing that he would receive. That was one of the most egregious acts that he could have done. So Wright introduces his stories with those things taught to us that were taught to him so that we understand the environment of these characters that we look at in these 4 stories. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking individually at each story. I'm going to reference some things that sort of overlap all of them. By now, you should have been through the first 4 stories, and those are the only ones we're going to be looking at. Big Boy Leaves Home, Down by the Riverside, Long Black Song, and then Fire and Cloud. Now, the first 3 stories all have individual characters as their center. The last one does as well, Fire and Cloud, but it also takes that individuality into a communal sense as the organized group of laborers and protesters works in conjunction with the main character, the Taylor character, as a way of saying this is certainly something being felt on an individual level, but also we need to see it as a communal identity. But if we look at Big Boy Leaves Home, we see some of those things that I've already mentioned. We see the presence of a military figure, right? We also see those natural elements that I talked about in the intro video, right? Water and hiding in caves and snakes and all of these things that are very present suggest a sort of raw and sort of unfiltered characterization of what is facing Big Boy after the incident in the early part of the story where he turns the violence around. He sort of flips the traditional way of violence in, we could argue, an accidental or maybe just an opportunistic, spur of the moment happening. But regardless, he turns the tables on what is typically going to happen. So all of the elements of the world are represented as being constructive to his fear, right? The entirety of his environment is going to collapse in on him. Fear becomes concrete. In literature, a lot of times we refer to this as naturalism, elements of naturalism. The world, the environment are very much a part of his fate. Okay? Now, if you go back to the actual incident, the happening surrounding his shooting this other boy, the crime leading up to this is one of those crimes that we're talking about. Him and his friends, naked before these other two. The intent, obviously, is meant to be seen as innocent, but in the circumstances of the time, all this ethics that we've already taken to learn is that this is more than enough to indicate threat and more so criminal and violent intent. So the man with the gun is, in terms of the time, appropriate in his response. Now, what changes here, what flips, is that Big Boy is kind of, an adolescent. You see that he's, between child and man, and we've got to think, learned all of these things that the Jim Crow ethics have taught him. And his need to survive, his instinct, kicks in, and it almost seems to be saying that it's unnatural for him to want to die cowardly, and it's an instinct of survival. And when the Army uniformed man, officially recognized American son, is pushing him down, even that is not enough. It's actually kind of a key that sets off that this America that he's a part of is out to destroy him and the people like him. So when he fires back, he turns the violence around, and he runs off, and he's working towards his escape, and we see all of these natural elements closing in on him. There's a sense of fear that's very palpable, but also perhaps a sense of hope. Not in a way that suggests, everything's going to be all right, but in a way that suggests everything might be violently shaken up and moving towards change. You get a resistant character here, and the fate of that character, we can't know for sure whether that ends violently. It would certainly be a lynchable offense were he to be caught, but we understand that things have changed a little bit, and there's an outlook, small sliver of sunshine at the end of that story, literally and figuratively. If you move on to down by the riverside, what you have here is a more grown character, a character named Man, which is, is it a general reference? Is this man in general, or is it, just a clever name as well? But again, we see the natural elements working here, the river and the water rising, and this sort of potential destruction that this, and the slow easing, the way a flood works and destroys is very ominous. And then the choices, the lack of choices this makes for man in trying to get his wife, to the hospital and all of these other things. The lack of choices that this creates is where the fear comes from, right? His opportunities, because he's a black man, are limited. The flood, right? There's also, and this isn't the only story where we see this. We see this in Fire and Cloud, and even in Long Black Song. Is almost biblical in its sort of reference, right? There's a very famous Old Testament flood in the book of Genesis that brings the world at that time to the brink of the regeneration, right? After the flood, Noah and the ark and his family are given the opportunity to start life anew. Because life before then had been insufficient and unsatisfying to God the Creator. And you get this sort of ominous feeling with this flood here as well. And it creates in all the people that, similar to Big Boy's instinctive an instinct to survive and to do what it takes to take care of their own people, even if it means going into the teeth of danger, etc. And he's looking, man is looking for the members of the community, white or black, to support him and help him in his small quest here, but he's not finding that help because the world is failing, and also simply because he's a black man in a stolen boat, and he's potentially up to no good. The potentiality of violence there is what sort of hovers over him. And in the end of this story, when he chooses to run and dies, is killed, we're left thinking, is this a movement of nobility? Right? Is he doing what Claude McKay suggests? Is he dying anyway? So he decides to sort of make his own independent movement, a movement of breaking through and breaking beyond the system, or is this a death of fear? And Wright sort of portrays that before us again, like he does with the end of the Big Boy story. Things are changing. Things are going to be advancing, moving forward. If we turn to the story Long Black Song, we have some questions to ask ourselves. What are the different issues raised in this story? We have a woman's point of view. We have other questions of morality being raised here, and ethics. If we look at Silas's last speech to Sarah about desperation and hopelessness, right? This is the situation that they're in. Is this a new twist on that no choice theme, right? This instinctive reactions that we've seen in the previous two stories, are they being readdressed here? This is how we must act in this situation. We're desperate, we're hopeless. Is this a new twist on that theme? And then also we again see more natural elements in this story to help sort of illuminate the fear that surrounds black men and women during this time. The snake, the water, the darkness, the open fields, all of these things have reappearances here in Long Black Song, as well as in Fire and Cloud, which is a very, very biblical-based story as well. Taylor sees the situation he's in, right? This sort of catch-22 caught between two worlds, but yet he begins to learn by the next generation. His son and his friends, etc., are beginning to push for new ideas, but the house divided shows that blacks at this time were in fact divided on going forward in terms of what their best interests were. Fear of lynching and fear of other repercussions was always very much prominent. There's a reference here to the Old Testament again, the book of Genesis, the Moses leading his people out of slavery by a fire, figure of fire at night, and a cloud during the day. Again, Wright is using this as a way to indicate there is hope and there is an escape potentially coming because things are changing. This is also, as I said in the intro, sort of translated from just the individual characters that we see in the previous three stories to a communal identity. And we see the group of people representing, in some ways, ex-slaves and of course, next generation of those former slaves, etc., as a way that also indicates the Moses reference from the Bible, but also Richard Wright's integration of communist Marxist thinking in terms of organizing the people that we talked about in the last video. This is infecting its way into Wright's art of the time, seeing communism and its attention to moving people on a communal level as being an important way of spreading social activism. This is just a quick way of going through the analytics of these stories. I will publish my notes for this as well, so you can go back over some of the things I said. And remember, and as this is going to be key with all the books, we're looking at one particular example from a very specific time in a way to try and talk about African Americans in literature. So there are things that have changed, of course, since then, and focuses that African American writers have looked at since then have changed, and all of these things are not always having to do with violence and racism, but the African American experience expressed through literature can be seen in a variety of ways that all have to deal with being identity-based, and Wright's stories very much focus on identity as a key factor in looking to change the world going forward, right? What are the changes going to be from that quote-unquote Uncle Tom characterization into his children, who no longer are going to sit there and be complacent. I'll leave it at that, and good luck with your quiz and your writing assignments.